On May the 27th, 1982, the British forces in the Falkland Islands broke out of their bridgehead at San Carlos and started the long march to Port Stanley. The move came after intense political pressure for an early British military success. Brigadier Thompson, the commander of the forces in the Falklands, had resisted the pressure for as long as he could, but now he was ordered to get moving. The men of 3 Commando Brigade were forced to walk. The loss of the container ship Atlantic Conveyor 2 days before had deprived the British of one of their most valuable assets, helicopters. The British forces faced an arduous hike across the mountains and bogs of East Falkland Island. While the Royal Marines and the 3rd Parachute Battalion walked north across the island, heading towards Port Stanley, the 400 troops of the 2nd Parachute Battalion were ordered to attack the Argentine garrison of 1,000 men at Goose Green, 17 miles to the south. Brigadier Thompson believed the attack on Goose Green was forced on him for political reasons.
I'd always regarded any battle for Goose Green as being a diversion from the aim of getting onto Stanley. And eventually, of course, I was ordered to carry out an operation to capture Goose Green. And though I thought it was a diversion at the time, I can understand why pressure was put on me to carry it out. And in the end, of course, some quite good things came out of it, because we learnt a number of useful lessons.
The settlement at Goose Green was the 2nd largest base for Argentine forces in the islands. The British Paras would be outnumbered and outgunned by nearly 3 to 1. They would be fighting with what little they could carry over open ground, without cover. The operation appeared a reckless gamble.
We were up against it right from the start because, again, we were going in like scales. We could only carry a certain amount of ammunition. Our mortars could only carry a certain amount of ammunition, and our guns, again, could only go forward so far because they had to be underslung by helicopter. And we had one naval ship for fire support. And everybody was of the opinion, if you're going to attack, you need the fire superiority and the troops to actually do the business.
The Paras also needed the advantage of surprise. This was denied them by London. The War Cabinet was hungry for an early demonstration of British military prowess. Number 10 briefed press and radio on the precise nature of the British move forward 24 hours before the attack.
So we set off and did a 20k night march over this terribly difficult terrain, very boggy, lumpy ground with very heavy packs, and overnight got to within 5 or 6 kilometers of a position from which we could launch the attack. And the plan was that we would spend the night and the next day lying up in this farm. And one of the ways in which we kept in touch with what was going on in the whole campaign was to tune into the world service of the BBC. And we tuned in, listened to the broadcasts, only to hear that we were being launched against Goose Green. The very thing that we were about to do had apparently been announced to the world.
My own view at the time was that was leaked from Number 10 to give political backing to the fact that British forces were getting on with the operation. And at the time it was notified. They hadn't, in fact. There was a rather nasty battle going on for Goose Green at that time. And, we couldn't be sure that Goose Green would be taken. I mean, it was one of the nastiest, if not the nastiest, engagement of the whole operation. So, I mean, I conveyed my displeasure in no uncertain terms to Number 10's office, quite frankly.
The attack on Goose Green started on the night of the 27th of May with a short naval bombardment of the Argentine garrison. The plan was for a rapid advance.
As with most beautiful plans, once you actually launch them into reality, they go wrong. After all, there were 400 of us trying to make it work, and there were 1,500 on the other side trying to screw it up. And as a result, it got screwed up. And our whole progress was much slower than we'd ever anticipated. We had a naval gunfire support, which we had hoped for during the night. That ceased because there was a malfunction in the gun. We had only ammunition for a raid, because there weren't any more resources, so we had very limited artillery fire, very limited mortar fire, because all the ammunition we had to carry in ourselves. So we were down to relying on courage, bayonets, machine guns, and close gutter fighting.
The personal dimension was brought home to me when our first dead man, as I rolled him over to identify him, had actually had a shot that had just gone through the side of his left eye and taken away the side of his skull. It was a soldier who I knew had got a young family, and I suddenly realised that our strength lay in the fact that we all knew each other, and we would do what was needed because we were friends, not because the Queen wanted us to do it, or Mrs. Thatcher, or the CO.
The commanding officer of 2 Para, Colonel H. Jones, led the attack on Goose Green. An impetuous and impatient man of extreme energy, he was happiest leading his men from the front.
And as dawn broke, we were only halfway there. And it was at that point that the attack on the left flank stalled. And H. Jones had to go forward to revitalise the energy in that attack.
I was firing at the Argentinian position, and I looked over, and Colonel H. Jones was actually facing the trench I was firing at, checking his submachine gun, and to make sure his magazine was full. He then put the magazine on, cocked the weapon, and started firing and charging up the hill. I continued firing to give him some fire support. And I realised quite quickly that the higher he was coming up the slope towards the trench he was attacking, he was coming into full view of the Argentinian position behind him. I looked across again over the top of my weapon. I could see the strike of the Argentinian rounds hitting the ground. So I told him to watch his fucking back, and he totally ignored me. Whether or not he heard me or not, I don't know. I think he ignored me, personally. And the higher he went up, the nearer he was to this fall of shot. All of a sudden, his body and the fall of shot coincided, and he was hit in the back. The momentum of the shot actually forced him forward, and he actually fell just within inches of the Argentinian trench he was actually going for.
He was putting online, really, the values that he'd espoused in peacetime, of courage, determination, maintain the momentum, keep pushing forward, keep the aggression going. And in that process, he lost his life. And it was at that point that I heard some words that I shall never forget, which were, "Sunray is down," which was the signal that something had happened to H, and that the pre-arranged plan of my assuming command would have to go into operation. And my heart beat fast as I heard those words, and tried to take in what it really meant. And this is really happening. I'm now in command of this, and I've got to somehow sort out this attack, which was clearly stalled, hadn't made the progress that we wanted, in broad daylight, on a terrain that was completely bare. There was no cover, there was no hedgerows, no trees, nothing. It was like a billiard table. And 1 in 5 of us was injured or killed, and our dead were lying next to us in this gorse gully, which was burning and full of smoke, and scattered with the debris of battle, burnt rifles and band-aids and bandages and garbage of war. And I really felt at a great loss as to what we would do. And I walked up this gully, and I thrust my hands into my pockets because they were so cold. And my fingers caught a piece of plastic that I'd had in my pocket. And I'd laminated a prayer from a French soldier. And I'd put it in my pocket, and I had a kind of bargain with God, you know. I'll carry this prayer. You look after me, okay? Stuff. And I knew this prayer well, and I suddenly thought, I need to say this. And in that darkness I stood there. In fact, I knelt down in this gorse, and I said this prayer. which was essentially abandoning myself to God and seeking his will, and whatever the outcome was, I'd live with that. And a most amazing kind of transformation occurred from feeling cold and fearful and uncertain and frightened. I suddenly felt joyful, hopeful, warm, and very clear about what we should do. And I turned around and went back to the boys and I said, I tell you what we're going to do. I'm going to seek a surrender tomorrow morning.
We looked over the settlement and we saw Colonel Keeble plus the Argentinians talking, and then the surrender started. And we thought, well, there isn't many, you know, a couple of hundred popped out. And then we looked towards the settlement and we saw these hundreds and hundreds of little lamps coming out of the buildings and forming into this column and marching up towards us. Up until that stage, the grassroots people in the battalion didn't want the Argentinians to surrender. We wanted to go in and take Goose Green because of the people that had died the previous day. When we actually saw the numbers of people coming out of the settlement, and we were glad, and everybody was glad that they actually surrendered.
The Argentine forces, mainly malnourished and poorly trained conscripts, had no stamina for a prolonged fight. The battle for Goose Green established a pattern for the war, a fierce skirmish, followed by the collapse of Argentine morale in the face of determined aggression.
Fue un momento muy duro, tal vez, me atrevería a decir, el momento más amargo de mi vida. Concurrimos a ese lugar, dejamos nuestro armamento y a partir de ese momento pasamos a ser prisioneros de guerra. Fue muy mentado y muy publicitado el hecho de que un batallón solo pudiese tomar 1050 prisioneros de guerra. Gran parte del dispositivo capturado en Darwin y Goose Green era personal de Fuerza Aérea, era personal técnico de apoyo a los Pucará no combatientes.
The politicians in London were given the early success which they demanded. After the British victory, 200 islanders were liberated from a community hall in which they had been held during the fighting. But the British had learned some salutary lessons. Henceforth, all fighting would take place under the cover of darkness, with better equipped forces and greater artillery support. The 2nd Parachute Battalion paid a high price for the victory at Goose Green. 18 men died, including the commanding officer, H. Jones, who was awarded a posthumous V.C.
In a very large, open grave, we buried our friends next door to each other. And then we stood round the grave and cried, grieved. Went through the pain of departure, of finishing, so that we could then start again and move forward to do whatever we had to do in order to achieve the overall objective, which was to capture Stanley.
Captain Gay, Lieutenant Barry, Corporal Hardman, Corporal Sullivan, Corporal Fryer, Lance Corporal Thorpe, Lance Corporal Smith, Lance Corporal Bingley, Private Holman.
On the 30th of May, reinforcements arrived from Britain. The new force was 5 Brigade, newly made up of men from the Gurkhas and the Scots and Welsh Guards. 5 Brigade had been hastily put together when intelligence revealed the Argentines' overwhelming superiority in numbers. But from the start, there had been concern about the ability and fitness of these fresh troops. They were ill prepared for battle, with poor equipment. The men had not worked together before. Even the Chief of the Defence Staff doubted whether they should have been sent.
I believe that the troops that we had originally sent down, the commandos and the paras, were enough and in a good enough position to finish the job off. And I think with hindsight, that it's a great pity that 5 Brigade were committed at all. If I had been the military commander on the spot, I think I would have been inclined to leave it to the troops who had already been blooded, who already had the fire of battle in their bellies, and let them get on with it, not waste time getting these other troops forward and risking ships.
Immediately after landing, 5 Brigade's Welsh Guards were ordered to march to Goose Green along the same route taken by the Paras 4 days before, but they couldn't make it.
The Welsh Guards were the first in the brigade to use that route, and what became patently obvious was that the route was impractical to take large quantities of rations, or far more important, ammunition and heavy equipment over, and that we simply could not do. And there is a point at which just sending a soldier over really makes no sense at all, because the soldier, unless he's got all the backup he needs at the far end, is going to be worse than useless and just another mouth to feed. And we had hoped to lift all our combat ammunition over and all our combat supplies over, and to use a batch of old snow tracks that we had embarked. But the snow tracks broke down and failed. It wasn't the Welsh Guards who broke down and failed. It was the vehicles we had, and the fact that we couldn't move anything other than what a man could carry.
I think it should be honestly admitted that 5 Brigade were not physically or mentally prepared for war. They had been told that they were going to be a garrison brigade, and indeed 2 of their battalions, replacing the parachute battalions, had come from public duties. And they were not in any sense match fit, either mentally or physically, when they landed at San Carlos. And I could see this as a doctor, and indeed it was confirmed when they were unable to make the journey on foot between San Carlos and Goose Green, a journey which 2 Para and the Gurkhas also did straight off their ships.
You'll always get this kind of cap badge rivalry and people who reckon that they can do things that other people can't do or anything else. All I can say is that the standards of physical fitness in the army, everyone takes the same battle test standards and has to pass them. Pure, simple physical fitness. Okay, some people may be more highly tuned than others, but they were certainly not unfit in any way at all. No, that's nonsense.
While the Welsh Guards were struggling to get to Goose Green, the men of 2 Para hijacked the 1 Chinook left to the British forces and made a daring advance forward.
We were fired up. We'd had our 4 or 5 days rest. We'd buried our dead. We wanted to get on. We wanted to capture Stanley. He who captures Stanley, in a sense, captures the Falkland Islands. And that's where we wanted to go to. And we wanted to go there fast.
The rapid move forward along the southern flank to Bluff Cove and Fitzroy was not welcomed by Land Force headquarters. Until reinforced, the advance party of Paras at Bluff Cove, close to Stanley, would be highly exposed. 5 Brigade, only recently arrived and unable to march from San Carlos, now had to move forward quickly to reinforce the vulnerable Paras at Bluff Cove. A disaster was in the making. The problem was that most of the British helicopters had been lost when the container ship Atlantic Conveyor was sunk. The remaining few were now allocated to Brigadier Thompson's Commando Brigade in the mountains on the northern flank, where they were put to use carrying ammunition and stores. Without helicopters, the commander of 5 Brigade in the south had to make do as best he could.
It was difficult. We needed more resources in this business of moving, as ever, ammunition forward, plus all the active backup that you need before you fight a battle, your field ambulance to allow them to set up so that your casualty evacuation chain is set up and prepared, all these things. And it all takes an awful lot of transport, whether it's helicopters or whether it's ships, and it was a slow and painful process getting it all together at that time.
Because 5 Brigade had no helicopters and could not march across the rough terrain, the only way to move the men forward to reinforce Fitzroy and Bluff Cove was by ship. At first the commando carriers Fearless and Intrepid were given the job, but after 2 hazardous journeys round the coast, the Commander-in-Chief in London ordered them to stop. He considered that the political risks of losing a large ship were too great. 2 companies of Welsh Guards, a rapier battery and the field ambulance were left stuck at San Carlos. They were ordered to sail to Fitzroy in smaller, less valuable landing ships. The Royal Fleet Auxiliary Sir Galahad was given to them. Ammunition was carried separately on a second ship, Sir Tristram.
Day broke on one morning and we looked out and were staggered to see two ships in the bay. And Steve Hughes, the doctor, and I said, well, yeah, I wonder how long it'll be before they're bombed. Because we'd seen the effectiveness of the Argentines and we knew that Fitzroy was in sight of the high ground around Stanley. And as we went out into the settlement, we talked to soldiers who were all of the same attitude. You know, who on earth would put ships there at this stage of the war in daylight?
High above the settlement of Fitzroy, an Argentine observation post on Mount Harriet tracked the arrival of the ships.
En las posiciones mías, que estaban en la ladera del Monte Harriet, teníamos acceso visual de Bluff Cove, Fitzroy y toda la zona aledaña a Bahía Agradable. Una mañana, los observadores míos me indican de que hay movimiento de barcos sobre esa zona. Verifico lo que me dicen los observadores y doy la novedad al comando superior.
At the Rio Grande Air Base in the south of Argentina, planes were loaded with their British-made 1,000-pound bombs in preparation for the attack on Fitzroy. At Fitzroy, Major Ewan South Battalion, in command of landing craft, tried to persuade the officers on board Sir Galahad to get their men off. Unwilling to be separated from their kit, they refused.
Unfortunately, and it is well tabulated, the argument came down to the relative ranks, and the fact that I was a major and they were majors was not going to be acceptable as an order. Well, my rage knew no bounds, frankly.
In desperation, South Battalion went ashore to 5 Brigade's tactical headquarters at Fitzroy and asked a senior officer to order the men off.
His first words to me were, Ewan, there's nobody on board that ship, there's just the hospital and some gunner ammunition. Everybody got off, all the troops, and I purposely not naming anybody because there was this great mix, got off last night. And now, without actually wishing to be obviously rude, it was quite an appalling admission by a brigade headquarters that they didn't know where half one of their battalions was and hadn't known where they were for 24 hours.
The men on board Sir Galahad were also concerned about the air threat as they waited, stuck inside the ship.
You were always aware of a risk of air attack. This threat was always with you, all the time, because we had jumped from one ship to another, and you could see the damage done by cannon fire, rockets and what have you, to these various ships.
Y recorrieron las Islas Malvinas al este, de norte a sur, buscando a los buques. Ya cuando no lo encontrábamos, un oficial, el más joven, pudo detectar entre las costas muy irregulares, en una bahía agradable, un mástil de uno de los buques, porque íbamos volando muy bajo, iban volando muy bajo. Entonces dijo, a la derecha. Toda la escuadrilla viró a la derecha, entró en esa bahía que era de muy difícil ubicación, volando a muy baja altura, y cuando se encontró en la bahía, encontraron los dos buques realizando la actividad de desembarco. Inmediatamente adoptaron la posición para el ataque y se lanzaron contra los dos buques.
We saw the plane just whiz past, probably about mast height or something. In a blur of a second, it's gone, you know, and you immediately look. I looked at it, and the color wasn't right. And it's then, almost simultaneously, about 3 or 4 people shouting, hit the deck. Even I shouted, hit the deck. And bang, that was it. All hell broke loose. We'd been hit. The one fear you had all the time, the one dread actually materialized. It happened. You know, these modern weapons are designed to kill. That's what they're there for. They have absolutely enormous power. The fireball it creates, the heat generated, the shrapnel, the debris that flies, the secondary detonations of ammunition. Quite enormous, awesome. That's when the devastation starts. Everything went flying. In the back of my head, the hearing, fantastic fire, heat everywhere, smoke, blackness, plunged into black. Although it was a lovely bright sunny day outside, it's black, pitch black, choking smoke. You think, God, you'd never seen anything like it. And the burns, tremendous burns, black, you know.
One felt so totally helpless that I stripped off to the waist and carried stretchers for 2 hours. I mean, somebody had to anyway, but I had nothing else to do, and I felt that was that was all I could do. I mean, I was so angry that I had to sort of, in a way, get rid of my anger by doing something physical. Not only was it physically demanding, it was, too, the most emotionally sapping thing I probably have ever done in my life. And yes, it was awful. And I felt slightly guilty.
Some helicopters came out of the smoke. And that was our cue. That was it. Get them off. And mercifully, these young, very brave pilots hovered over us. Couldn't land. Couldn't come too close because of the rigging and whatever and the flames. So they'd hover. And we were passing casualties up to them. Very badly injured people. It was terrible. So I made a beeline for the bow of the ship, round the tank deck. And somebody must have recognized me saying, medical corps. He's a medic. And you attract, as a medic, you seem to attract casualties. They make a beeline for you, or the soldiers on board, the Welsh Guards, bring the casualties to you. And that's very sad.
That evening, I talked to the captain of the ship on the beach, and we stood there in the flames of his ship, and he'd got tears streaming down his face, and I had. And I remember him saying, I told them to get off, and they wouldn't get off.
General Wolfe, who was a great amphibious operations man, said that the Admiral must lose no time in running into the enemy's port and getting his troops on shore. And they ran into the port, but they didn't get the troops on shore, and they were caught. If only they had landed the moment that Sir Galahad arrived, then the casualties might have been much fewer.
The commander of 5 Brigade, Brigadier Wilson, was at San Carlos when the ships were hit. He was quite unaware of the disaster until his return to Fitzroy that same evening.
I suppose it's inevitable that if something appears to go wrong in war, that the commander of any formation or the commander of whatever unit is going to be held responsible, and broadly speaking, one does accept complete responsibility for anything that happens to anyone under your command. In that, yes, loosely speaking, if that happened, you could say, I suppose, that I was the person who should be held to blame, not necessarily made the scapegoat. I don't think we use that word. But I think that there's been, I think a lot of false information was circulated very early on, and I don't think it was ever corrected. That somehow through bad planning, distance, idleness, or, sheer incompetence, they allowed ship-carrying soldiers to come forward in daylight and remain anchored off a beach, and it got trapped in the way inadequate air defenses, something of this order, and that the disaster therefore was shall we say, part and parcel of really sloppy staff work or bad planning or, what shall we say, incompetence, I used the word earlier, incompetence on the part of the brigade staff. It's totally untrue.
The loss of the Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram and the deaths of 50 men had many causes which go far beyond the lack of air cover and the failure to disembark the men. In the bloody chaos of war, the shortage of helicopters, the poor communications and command structure of 5 Brigade, and the lack of fitness of the guardsmen, all contributed to the disaster.
It was a stress in the personal sense, and one is always distressed by casualties, for heaven's sake. They're people one's concerned with, they're people one's responsible for, they are people one loves, honestly. And therefore, you know, one feels it very deeply. But actually, if you look back on it now, in terms of a setback, in terms of the war as a whole, I have to say it was not a very severe setback in terms of getting on with.
The race was now on for Port Stanley. On the 10th of June, General Moore, the commander of the land forces, ordered his men to prepare for the final battle. There was considerable cap badge rivalry between the Paras and Royal Marines in the north and 5 Brigades Army troops in the south, each unit vying for the chance to be first to liberate the island's capital.
I'm sure the kind of implicit assumptions were that the Royal Marines, supported by the Paras, were going to capture Stanley, and the garrisoning of Stanley would be done by the army. I think that was implicit in the whole way in which the campaign was fought, and drove General Moore and his staff to make it a Royal Marine show.
At Bluff Cove, the soldiers of 5 Brigade, recovering from the disastrous Argentine air attack, were preparing for the battle ahead, but senior officers suspected that General Moore had now lost confidence in the brigade's leadership.
You must know exactly where everyone is and what their orders are for the next 24 or 48 hours.
Brigadier Wilson, 5 Brigade's commander, was keen for his men to have the chance to be the first into Stanley.
It's marked on it, but that's not necessarily important.
Wilson was also becoming increasingly resentful at what he saw as General Moore's preference for the Royal Marines.
No doubt at all, we've got off to an extraordinarily good start here, despite some of the incidents that have happened since we arrived in this part of the world. We are in a very good position indeed. I intend to capitalize on it. I think we started to suffer to some extent from what appeared to be a cap badge rivalry, when it seemed that most of the resources were being allocated to the other brigade, and therefore my people started to feel that they were not only deprived, but had been, shall we say, cast into the role of being, giving a light title to it, shall we say, the Cinderella of the Falklands, something of that order.
The question of cap badge politics always comes up, I think, and certainly in the context of this war, where the Royal Marines were very much to the fore because it was an amphibious operation, I was at various times a little concerned lest it get in the way of things. I think that in one sense it's very healthy. It's very healthy in the sense that it makes units want to perform and not want to let their regiment down in front of other regiments. That's what regimental systems are for, and a very good thing too. But if it comes to the point, of course, where it gets in the way of operating, then it's a very bad thing.
No, correct! Hey, no, we should be no, yes, everybody, fire!
On June the 11th, the final British attack began. After the initial bombardments, all fighting took place at night.
Now, the problem with fighting at night is that it's very difficult to maintain control over your own troops, and it needs well-trained and really well-motivated troops to get away with it. Well, I was lucky because I had exceedingly well-trained troops and well-motivated troops, and I knew that though it would be chaotic, we would be able to create order out of the chaos quicker than the less well-trained Argentinians and take advantage of the darkness to close onto their positions and avoid the business of being shot at long ranges by their heavy machine guns.
And we kept getting nearer and nearer, and nothing was happening. And we got nearer and nearer, and still nothing happened. And I'm thinking, well, they must have gone home or something. And then we got within about 100 meters of, some of us a little bit closer actually, but about 100 meters. And suddenly, they must have seen us. And the place just lit up like a Star Wars film. There was red and green tracer going everywhere. So we hit the deck and we'd made contact then. And you could hear blokes saying, I can remember, and he had a really distinct voice, a guy we used to call Little Tomo. And I could hear him screaming, fix bayonets, so he was in amongst it somewhere. And it was just all like slow motion.
It's who's quickest on the draw, going back to the old cowboy days. If you think about it too long, you end up dead. We all know what a 7.62 round can do to the body. It's not a pretty sight. So you're quicker. You make a point of being quicker. And if you have a stoppage, then you do something else. You're fighting for your life, not only yours, but the rest of the lads as well. Because if you don't get him, he might get somebody else.
I went round the back of this large rock that I just looked round, changed my magazines, took out the 2 grenades I had left, basically pulled the pins on them, stepped round the corner, sent the white phosphorus grenade into the middle for the people and the gun in the middle, and the HE grenade, which is the high explosive grenade, to the gun on the end, and then stepped back round the corner, counted the time delay, waited for both bangs, then I just stepped round the corner and anything that moved got 3 rounds.
In the end, it was the amount of firepower and the actual aggression of the soldier to get in there and to get the other ones out. And they just didn't have the will to do that, to stay. In the end, they just ran off the back of the mountain towards Stanley.
You kept arriving at what you thought was the summit and then finding there was more of it still to go up. And I remember topping the last crest, and it was the top. And I looked down and I could see, really not very far away, Port Stanley, and I could see the lights still on the streets, cars going up and down the streets, people going about their normal business. And it was quite surreal, really, because there was civilization, and here was a bunch of people on the top of a hill trying to kill each other.
On June the 14th, after 2 nights of heavy fighting, the British prepared to take Port Stanley. Brigadier Wilson believed that 5 Brigade was poised to be the first into the island's capital. Having captured Mount Tumbledown, he needed only to advance and capture the one remaining peak before Stanley, Sapper Hill. But General Moore ordered him to stop.
I told both my brigades to stop so as to have a buffer zone. My real concern was that if everybody went dashing off into Stanley from all sorts of directions, we'd get a confusion and end up shooting our own people, let alone any others. This was nothing to do with favouring one brigade over the other. It was just sheer common sense, it seemed to me.
But there would be no victors in the race to Stanley. Early in the morning of June the 14th, the forces defending Port Stanley gave up the battle. Downcast and demoralised by the constant bombardment, short of food and supplies, and suffering from the bitter cold, conscript and professional Argentine soldiers alike refused to fight on. From the encircling mountains, lines of Argentine soldiers could be seen fleeing from their positions.
Gentlemen, I've just heard that the white flag is flying over Stanley.
General Menendez decided to accept the British offer of a ceasefire before Brigadier Wilson's troops could advance any further.
Los ingleses nos habían dicho que ofrecían el cese del fuego porque consideraban que ya los argentinos habían demostrado su valentía, su bravura en el combate y que todo lo que viniera después eran muertes inútiles, cosa que yo compartía, porque por lo que me había contestado el general Galtieri no había ninguna otra posibilidad ya. Incluso yo le pregunté si yo podía esperar algún refuerzo o algo, y me dijo que no me podía prometer nada.
As the victorious British troops marched into Stanley, their commander, General Moore, borrowed a phrase from the Duke of Wellington and said, "It was a damn close-run thing." The Argentine surrender came not a moment too soon for the British forces, whose offensive was on the point of stalling for lack of supplies and ammunition. The same Marines who surrendered to the Argentine invasion force just over 2 months before now raised the Union flag once again at Government House. By the time the first British units entered Stanley, the Falkland Islands capital was in chaos. The Argentine troops' morale had collapsed.
Y sentimos una gran tristeza, pero la tristeza era racional, porque quien estuvo en las islas y fue viendo cómo evolucionó toda la situación y la magnitud del poder de combate enemigo, sin duda no podía apreciar racionalmente otra cosa. Nuestro corazón nos dictaba ganas de seguir en las islas, de mantenerlas en el patrimonio nacional, pero sabíamos que racionalmente, desde el punto de vista poder de combate, era imposible.
It seemed as if the soldiers really didn't know why they were there. And I asked a number of them, why didn't you die for this place? This is the Las Malvinas. Why didn't you die for your place? And you could see and tell from the way they responded that they didn't really believe in this operation. It wasn't really their country. They didn't need it so badly that they'd give their life for it. And then you actually saw the conditions in which they had been living in. You looked at the trenches, the scarcity of their rations, and the badly damaged equipment, and the lack of discipline that had obviously permeated the place for a month. And I know conditions were pretty bad, but there was no shelter, no cover for them. They were badly looked after. They clearly were not a highly trained force, as we were. Defeated, dispirited, disillusioned, just like cattle, numb, distraught, bemused. They were kids, really. And they just filed up, delivered their weapons, and just hung around waiting to be sent home.
El combate de Puerto Argentino ha finalizado.
In Buenos Aires, President Galtieri accepted defeat and appealed to the nation for calm.
Lucharon con esfuerzo supremo por la dignidad de la nación. Los que cayeron están vivos para siempre.
The people of Argentina did not listen to his appeals. Rioting broke out where only weeks before millions had come to celebrate the recapture of the Malvinas. The military junta was soon forced from office and faced trial for its bungling and incompetent handling of the crisis. If anything had been gained, it was democracy. A few months after the war, Argentina went to the polls for the first time in years to elect a new government. To many in Argentina, the conflict had achieved something more. It brought an ignored and forgotten dispute to the world's attention.
En cambio, si no se hubiera producido las cosas que pasaron, lo más fácil para los británicos es, como habían hecho durante muchos años, es tapar el problema y mantenerlo, yo diría, cocinándose, pero a fuego muy lento. En cambio ahora está hirviendo. Ya no tan hirviendo, pero por lo menos está caliente. Entonces, creo que desde ese punto de vista es beneficioso para nosotros.
The Falklands factor was extremely beneficial to Mrs. Thatcher. Her reputation was enhanced by the war.
I must go down and report.
And many believed that it helped her to win the next election.
Well, obviously it was extremely favourable to Mrs. Thatcher, and I think that was deserved. After all, before it began, she was at a very low rating in the opinion polls. There were a great many economic and political difficulties, and this extraordinary venture and her determination and courage throughout it, which she demonstrated very clearly, And its success at the end of the day made a very big difference. Because what people like is success. Failure is no good. But if somebody has success and in a difficult, prolonged struggle like this, watched by hundreds of millions of people all around the world, it was a major thing. And everybody sat up and thought, oh gosh, these people really are to be reckoned with.
The men who fought in the Falklands returned to Britain in triumph. The armed forces had been asked to do a near impossible job, to fight thousands of miles from home without sufficient air cover against a far larger defending force. It had been an almost reckless gamble taken by Mrs. Thatcher, whose political survival depended on its outcome. She risked all and won. With Britain triumphant, she was able to claim that the victory had turned the tide of the country's decline.
It was achieved by men and women who had no illusions about the difficulties. We faced them squarely and we were determined to overcome. That is increasingly the mood of Britain. What has indeed happened is that now once again Britain is not prepared to be pushed around. We have ceased to be a nation in retreat.
A declining empire is a very dangerous thing because it has continually to reassure its people that it's not being kicked about. And looking back on it with a longer perspective still, these will be seen as the last kicks of an imperial power in order to restore its self-confidence. The future lies in the peaceful settlement of disputes and a greater role for the United Nations and so on and so on.
For an evil military dictatorship to get away with unprovoked aggression at this part of the 20th century would have made the world a much more dangerous place to live in. It would have undermined Western deterrence vis-à-vis the Soviet Union, but it's even conceivable that perestroika might never have happened if we hadn't demonstrated this intention not to allow a dictatorship to get away with it.
I think it will be remembered in the history books as our last colonial war. And certainly I think that military historians will regard it as an incredible achievement. One can never say that another aberration of this kind won't arise, but it certainly would be an extraordinarily bad guide to future defense policy.
The problem of sovereignty over the Falkland Islands remains. The British military victory did nothing to settle a dispute which seems to have no solution. Today, the islands are a fortress guarded day and night by a garrison of 2,000 British troops. While the Argentine claim to the islands is as strong as ever, Britain has formally stated that sovereignty is no longer negotiable. The negotiating process is at a standstill.
There's no question about it that Argentina will never abandon or modify its claim to the islands. No doubt about that. On our side, I cannot see any future British government forcing the islanders into becoming Argentine. I equally can't see any British government leaving the islands adequately garrisoned in the future after what happened in 1982. So, if you put all those things together, you have a recipe for indefinite deadlock.
It's no longer an obscure dispute somehow lost in the southern Atlantic. Now it's an issue that has taken two countries into war. It needs a solution. If we want to be ready to enter a new century, we cannot do that safely unless we solve the 19th century disputes.